Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 5. Philip as Regent of Spain, 1543 to 1547. Philip's character hardened and matured rapidly from his 18th to his 21st year, until by 1547 he was his own man. Circumstances forced him to make his own decisions by removing his three chief advisers. The cardinal died soon after Maria, and his loss, said the emperor, was the greater, for there were plenty of wives to be had, but only one Tebera. Old Cobos followed him to the grave in 1547. Alba had gone to Germany to aid his imperial master against the Lutherans. It was young Philip's chance to show what he could do. He gave a demonstration that must have aroused in his father conflicting sentiments of pride and disappointment. Charles was a man of strong contrasts. He was at once pious and carnal, reverent and proud. His spiritual condition seemed to fluctuate with the state of his treasury and that of his health. Regardless of the warnings of his physicians, he would stuff himself with incredible meals, chiefly of meat, washed down with huge flagons of Rhenish wine. He liked his supper at midnight and his beer at 5 in the morning. In spite of his advice to Philip to be faithful in marriage, his own affair with Barbara Blomberg dates from this period. When Charles enjoyed reasonably good health, the pagan in him gained the upper hand. When gout tormented him, he would repent and make amends with prayer and the discipline. His attitude towards the church varied accordingly. At times he longed for nothing more than to leave the noisy world for the quiet of a monastery. There were other moments when he gave occasion for fears that his anger and impatience might lead him down the dangerous path of Henry VIII, to the complete ruin of Spain and of Christendom. At such times he took a ruthless view of church rights and church property. The Caesar in him did violence to the Christian and to the things that were God's. Still rankling from the Pope's refusal to let him sell all immovable ecclesiastical property throughout the empire for use against the Turks in 1529, he conceived in 1545 a plan to loot the church in Spain. The danger of the utter ruin with which the heretics threaten Christendom is so great that the Roman See must help us with a considerable sum of money against the Protestants, he wrote Cobos on February 17th of that year. Prelates and ecclesiastics should, in our opinion, contribute most liberally to the expenses of efforts to suppress heresy. From prelates and churches in Spain much money is to be obtained, and we desire you to take the preliminary steps. This must be done with the greatest secrecy, for if the prelates learn beforehand that they are to be thus taxed, some of them might betray the matter to the Protestants in order to prevent the execution of the measures intended. In 1546 he was still attempting to make the church pay for his wars on the ground that they were religious. When Pope Paul III denied his request for the appropriation of half the church plate in all his dominions and half the annual repair fund of the churches and monasteries, he was very angry. His envoy in Rome told the Holy Father that the emperor intended to carry out his design with or without permission. He was highly incensed over Paul's suggestion that he join Francis I in a crusade against the successor of Henry VIII. He declared that he would take the church revenues with a good conscience. Ferdinand the Catholic had done so, and he was as saintly a man as any. Paul, who did not share the emperor's high opinion of his grandfather's holiness, had no intention of despoiling the churches to increase a secular power that was already too great in Italy for the freedom of the church. Perhaps he knew also that Charles's gout was driving him to threats in excess of his real intentions. But he granted the enormous sum of 500,000 ducats on the Spanish monasteries and paid part of it. This, however, failed to meet the necessities of Charles. Towards the end of 1546, he sent an envoy to Rome to urge the Pope to complete the sum promised. On November 28th, he dispatched a letter to Philip, telling what he had done and what he intended to do. He had decided upon the loot of the church, whether the Pope liked it or not. Philip's reply of January 25th, 1547, is illuminating in several respects. It not only shows the tact, judgment and grasp of affairs the prince had attained in his 20th year, but reveals the healthy spirit of independence that checked despotism in Spain, at once the most Catholic and the most truly democratic country in the world. Philip began tactfully by saying that his joy at the emperor's success was tempered by sorrow at hearing that his majesty was suffering from gout again. He begged for constant news of the emperor's health and said he would be most anxious to hear. He then noted what the emperor had done in Rome, and that, since this would be inadequate, Charles intended to ask the Pope to let him appropriate 1/2 of the gold, silver, and jewels of all the churches and monasteries of these realms, and half the value of the cathedral fabrics. If His Holiness refuses this concession, I note that your Majesty's confessor is of opinion that it is so good and holy a cause you would be justified in taking this contribution on your own authority. I summon to my presence the Marquess de Montejard, the Archbishop of Seville, and the Council of Finance, informed them of your Majesty's need of help, told them to consider the matter well secretly, and to report to me for your Majesty's information. The Council believed that it would not be advantageous to your Majesty's service to adopt the course suggested, nor would it redound to the benefit of these realms. Much less would this be the case if His Holiness refused his consent, seeing the evil name it would bring to your Majesty throughout Christendom, especially bearing in mind the action of the King of England towards the churches in his realm. The example cited of the King of France was not considered a sufficient justification for your Majesty's proposed step, since throughout the world your Majesty's devotion and fidelity to religion are notorious, and the difference between the actions of the one monarch and the other is recognised everywhere. Much scandal would be raised through Spain. Consider, your Majesty, what perturbation would be caused in all people's minds, not only to the clergy who are so much a part of these realms, as your Majesty knows, but still greater trouble would be caused to laymen, who would conclude that no security existed anywhere, since even sacred property devoted to divine service was not spared from attack. Charity and devotion too would be lost, and the people would discontinue to benefit the Church in the belief that whenever pressing need occurred, a similar measure moreover would again be adopted. In France, people may tolerate such things owing to the fact that the King of France rules rather as a despot than as a natural overlord, Seigneur Natural, and follows his whim rather than his reason, which your Majesty will not do, and besides this, the French people, as your Majesty knows, are willing to put up with anything, and the difference between the two nations in this respect is very great. These realms and your subjects in them expect to be treated in a different fashion, in accordance with their character, their valour, and their merits in your Majesty's service. Those present at the council voted unanimously against the Emperor's project. It was resolved that your Majesty be advised of this with all speed, in order that you should not continue to depend upon this means of obtaining funds, and that your Majesty, in view of all the facts, and having consideration to what is due to your repute, your Christian character, your respect to the Apostolic See, and the preservation of these realms, may arrive at a final solution worthy of your Catholic spirit. On the whole, in spite of his chronic need of money, Charles had been successful in his undertakings thus far. He had beautifully turned the tables on Francis I and his Lutheran allies in revenge for their treacherous attacks on him after his return from the failure at Algiers. About the time of Philip's marriage, he had skillfully snatched victory from defeat in a memorable series of campaigns. First, he struck swiftly in Guelders, routing the Duke of Cleves. Then, with the timely aid of Henry VIII, he boldly invaded France and advanced to the gates of Paris. France seemed ready to fall into his outstretched hand, and might have done so if Henry had cooperated to the extent of his promises. But that monarch had sat down before Boulogne and refused to budge, in spite of any appeals for assistance, until it was taken, by which time Francis I had saved his kingdom by signing the Peace of Crespy. Charles was thus cheated of the fruits of his victory, but was free to deal with the Lutherans. It was high time. The Smalkaldic League, organised by the Elector of Saxony, Philip of Hesse, and other Protestants as a protest against the election of Charles's brother Ferdinand as King of the Romans, which the Emperor had arranged in 1530, had grown to be a formidable power. As Catholic princes died and were succeeded by Protestant sons, as Joachim I of Brandenburg, for example, its numbers increased, until in 1546, when Luther went to his grave lamenting that Wittenberg had become worse than Sodom under the new dispensation, the League had an army of 50,000, which laid waste Catholic sections of Germany with fire and sword, and in particular warred against churches, monasteries and convents. Albert Alcibiades of Brandenburg, known as Albrecht the Burner because of his love for seeing the houses of his fellow Germans in flames, especially if they happened to be those of bishops or priests, boasted loudly that he had chosen the devil instead of God for his master. No one disputed him. When Charles moved on Landshut to commence his campaign of retribution, he had only 6,000 men, while the Protestants had 7,000 horse and 50,000 foot. These figures are a sufficient refutation of the charge that the emperor took the Lutherans by surprise. They also suggest how masterly was the campaign he carried on. Reinforced at Landshut by the papal army under Ottavio Farnese and Alessandro Vitelli and other Italian troops, he assembled 28,000 men at Regensburg under Alba's command and made a rapid night march on Ingolstadt. With further reinforcements from the Netherlands, he was able to take the offensive. He drove the enemy up the Danube in October 1546, refused to go into winter quarters in spite of the rains, the plague of fever, and his recurring sickness, completed the subjection of southern Germany, garrisoned the towns, sent his best troops to aid his brother Ferdinand in Bohemia, marched to Eger to join the Protestant Maurice of Saxony, who had gone over to his side, and after Easter 1547 entered Saxony with 26,000 men, while the enemy burned the bridge over the Elbe and retreated down the river to Mühlberg. Charles marched at midnight, April 23rd, reached the riverbank opposite Mühlberg at 9 o'clock in the morning. As soon as Alba's light horse had found a ford, the emperor, pale as death and thin as a skeleton, rapidly surveyed the situation and gave his commands. By the bank there hung a maimed crucifix, the arms of the Christus broken by some Lutheran iconoclast. "I will avenge thy wrongs," cried Charles. He dashed into the water up to his saddle girths and made for the heretic city. The battle raged all day. Charles, ill though he was in the saddle 21 hours. It was dusk when Alba made his decisive attack. The Saxons fled, leaving a third of their number dead behind them. "I came, I saw, and God conquered," said Charles. He was now master of Germany. He gave the lands of the Elector John Frederick to Maurice of Saxony, who had helped him, but spared the Elector's life, for he was magnanimous in victory. At Wittenberg, when urged by some zealot to disinter the body of Luther and cast it to the dogs, he replied coldly, "I war with the living." The campaign over, Pope Paul III withdrew his troops. Charles was furious. He accused the Pope of having gone over to the French, who had told him the Emperor was seeking universal empire under the cloak of religion. He told the nuncio he knew his duty to God better than the Pope did, and he would go to Rome and tell him so. Meanwhile, Paul, after many difficulties, had at last assembled the needed council at Trent. While the Protestants refused to recognise it, Charles himself did as much as anyone to make it a failure, by his refusal to permit a clean-cut definition of Catholic principles on the points disputed. He would have no discussion of original sin or justification until he finished fighting against the German princes. He wanted only a reform of discipline. Very reluctantly, then, Paul agreed to a compromise whereby the two would be taken up together. But when he published the decree on justification in January 1547, the emperor angrily threatened to supersede the council with an imperial synod. In March, on account of the plague, the council was transferred from Trent to Boulogne. Charles, indignant, kept the Spanish bishops at Trent and refused to recognise the council at Boulogne. This was while he was on the way to Mühlberg. The following year he published, during the armed diet of Augsburg, his mischievous interim, in which he usurped many of the functions of the Church. Intending to maintain the religious status quo by some sort of compromise until the council settled the quarrel, he leaned far toward Lutheranism, in the opinion of Catholics, allowed clergy to marry, for example, and granted the cup to the laity. It was the most fatal of all the emperor's mistakes, displeasing Protestants as well as Catholics, and avoiding open disobedience to the Pope only because Charles delayed receiving the nuncio, who came with the inevitable refusal of the Holy Father, until after the ambiguous compromise was passed by the Diet. The Protestants at Augsburg, according to Sandoval, were dangling before the eyes of the sick and weary emperor a terrible temptation, the establishment of a state church over which he and his successors would be supreme, and over which the Pope would have a nominal authority, if any. Even the disciplinary reforms urged by Charles and the Spanish bishops until the suspension of the Council of Trent, a dismal failure in 1552, tended in this direction. The king would nominate bishops, as in Spain. The bishops must reside in their dioceses and could appoint the parochial clergy. Appeals to Rome and interference by Rome would be minimized. If Charles and his prelates failed to see the danger in this, it was because the system had worked out fairly well in Spain under exceptional circumstances. It was the system adopted by Ferdinand and Isabella during a great crusade, together with the Inquisition. It had seemed to them necessary if the Spanish church were to be freed of Jewish influence. It was argued that under rulers so devout and so Catholic at heart as Isabella, the great Cardinal Ximenes, and Charles himself, a strong national church under strong royal discipline strengthened rather than weakened the universal church in the then state of Christendom. But the piety and firmness of Isabella and her immediate successors could not be predicated of all future kings. A Henry VIII, prey to his passions, dominated by a clever, irreligious woman, could tear a whole nation from the Church of Christ under pretext of reform. A Francis I could do infinite harm to Christendom in 100 ways. The scandals that had occurred in all parts of Christendom as a result of the royal nomination of bishops and the interference of the state in the affairs of the church generally were only too obvious. They were especially so from the central point of view of the Italian prelates. Some of these, to be sure, had a selfish interest in perpetuating the disciplinary abuses which the Spanish sought to correct, for their livelihoods depended upon them. Others, on the contrary, were holy men who saw the principle above all, who understood that if all churches were national, the papal court would lose not merely the material support derived from appeals, pensions, and foreign benefices, but its spiritual authority, and that was an essential matter. Better than the Spanish prelates, they understood that, important as discipline was, doctrine came first. Discipline could always be corrected, but once a single article of faith was sacrificed, the whole unified system of Catholic belief was soon lost. An organic, living thing cannot be divided. The health of Charles became rapidly worse after his exertions at Mulberg. In August he was so ill with a high fever that his death was expected. Mary of Hungary hastened from the Netherlands and King Ferdinand from the east to their brother's bedside, while young Prince Maximilian made the opening speech to the Diet. Charles recovered, but the conviction that he had almost reached the end of his life remained with him. He resolved to set his affairs in order. One thing he wished to be sure of was that Philip would inherit the empire. It had been understood when Charles was elected emperor that his brother Ferdinand would succeed him, but the succession to Ferdinand had been left in abeyance. It now happened that Ferdinand had sons of his own, and was more ambitious than Charles had suspected. Brought up separately, the brothers had hardly become acquainted until middle life. Charles at first had liked the younger man, with his amiable compliance and his simple piety, but he had lately come to discover something else behind that adenoidal countenance with its shrewd eyes, its beak of a nose, and its retreating chin. He had learned, at least so he wrote Mary, that Ferdinand and his son Maximilian had been secretly working on the Diet, raising bogus rumours about the danger in Hungary, perhaps even purposefully creating it, to gain a subsidy for that country at the expense of Charles's plans for the pacification of Germany. There were violent scenes, sullen silences. When Ferdinand said he had acted according to his conscience and honour, Charles retorted that when men wished to do wrong, they always invoked conscience and honour. But the truth was that Ferdinand wanted everything for himself and his family. Mary had to make peace between them more than once. Both were surrounded by astute men who had reasons for trying to separate them. It was not merely on Philip's account that Charles wished him to be emperor. He foresaw that if the imperial succession went to the junior house, it would lose its European significance and become merely the titular honour of a German prince. As the two branches inevitably drifted apart, France would have an opportunity to strike at either one separately, as it suited her, and to make herself dominant in Europe, to the injury of Christendom. Charles thought as well as to Spain. The Habsburg Empire united would be a bulwark against the Turk both in Eastern Europe and on the Mediterranean. England, even if it remained Protestant, would be kept in its place, with Flanders as a wedge and a base between it and France. The unity and strength of Christendom depended on Philip's becoming emperor. Ferdinand saw the wisdom of this, and so did Mary. As for the genial Maximilian, he professed to have no choice. The emperor, much relieved, decided to send for Philip at once. The prince's general development and his unexpected grasp of the art of government had won favourable comment all over Europe. It might be well now to have him show himself in the Netherlands and Germany and make a good impression on the electors of the empire. The emperor therefore bade young Ruy Gómez, who had just come from Spain with Philip's congratulations on the victory at Mulberg and the capture of John Frederick, to return at once with the imperial summons. Maximilian was to follow as soon as possible, to marry Philip's sister Maria and to act as regent for Spain during Philip's absence. The experience no doubt would be good for Maximilian. Charles was not too ill to see that it would be more convenient for Philip when he appeared in the north if Maximilian were absent. Ruy Gomez found Philip late in the autumn at Monzon, where he had gone to preside for the first time at the Cortes of Aragon, Valencia and Catalonia, to the general contentment, wrote Calvete de Estrella, of all the inhabitants thereof. The prince, who had grieved much over his father's illness, was overjoyed to hear of his convalescence, and prepared to obey the summons to Augsburg as soon as the long and difficult session was ended. On December 8th, 1547, he left Monzon with his friend and mayordomo mayor and rode west over the mountains. Philip liked Ruy Gomez de Silva better than anyone in the world, except perhaps his father. Alba he respected and feared, but there was something in Ruy Gomez that inspired confidence and affection. The Empress had been fond of him and had made him page to Philip, 5 years his junior, while the latter was still in his cradle. He had dressed Philip and undressed him. He had played games with him and helped him with his studies. He had gone with him everywhere and had slept in the same room. Philip could not remember a time when there had been no Ruy Gomez at hand to help him, to advise him and to divert him, in short, to be an older brother. He trusted him absolutely, not only in boyhood and youth, but until the day of Ruy's death in 1572. Though Ruy Gomez bore a name frequently found among Spanish and Portuguese Christians of Jewish descent, he derived from the ancient nobility of Portugal and was devoted to the church. Dark and handsome he was at 25, intelligent and prudent, in the words of Cabrera. Modest, agreeable, without artifice, and brief of speech, he spoke only what was necessary and at the right moment. He was notoriously a squire of dames, and he was ambitious. Nevertheless, says Cabrera, he never gained power by evil means, but conquered his rivals by courtesy, and by conferring benefactions upon them in a spirit that was generous and Christian. He was careful not to dress more brilliantly than the king and those near him, even when he had the means to do so. Like Philip, he instinctively preferred conciliation to violence. It was inevitable, perhaps, that he and Alba should form the focal points of two of those factions that Charles had urged Philip to encourage for his own independence. So the blonde prince and his dark friend cantered over the wintry roads until they came to Alcalá de Henares, where Philip's sisters and his 2-year-old son were living under the care of Bishop Silicio. Philip arrived in high good humour, anxious to see his son and to start preparations for his journey. Little Don Carlos, no doubt, had grown tremendously. His resemblance to his father was already striking, but in a grotesque way. He was like a small caricature of Philip, with a head too large for his frail body and a look of suffering on his solemn face. Philip's elder sister, Maria, was just 20, and in the full bloom of a beauty that was Germanic rather than Spanish. She had her mother's small mouth and the same beautiful hands. Her blonde hair, in Moreau's portrait, was much less luxuriant and arranged more compactly. Her face was fine, spiritual, and intelligent. Joanna, 8 years younger, had more of the Habsburg look than her sister. Her skin was fair, her hair auburn. Her lower lip was very prominent, with a cleft under it, her nose slightly crooked. The upper part of her face was better, the eyes far apart, fine and brooding, the brow high and wide. If we may trust Moreau's brush, she was not as attractive as Maria, but had more character. There was an expression of extreme determination, even stubbornness, in her wide mouth, a mouth like the emperor's, and in the whole face a suggestion of patient suffering. She was already beginning to have that grave, majestic walk that Cabrera noted. Philip's arrival with Ruy Gomez was a signal for several days of festivities. There were jousts and juegos de canas, banquets and balls by night. Maria and her sister abandoned themselves so joyfully to these last festivities before marriage that gossips and grave elder persons blamed them for too much levity. Cabrera does not make clear, however, what form their levity took. He contents himself with recording somewhat ambiguously that the prince so loved and accompanied the infantas that their virtues did not enrich the monasteries with examples of sanctity. Indeed, none had such seclusion, purity, and religion as their palace. We learn also that the prince took side with the ladies when they were criticised, for, adds Cabrera, he did not abhor entertainments, and it seemed to him more humanity and courtesy to mingle in the pastimes of the palace and of the court. Prince Maximilian was on his way from Germany through Italy. He was to sail for Barcelona in the fleet of Andrea Doria and make his way overland to Valladolid. It seemed as if he would never arrive. Alba, however, appeared at Alcalá while the fiestas were still in progress. Nothing stopped him when he wished to go anywhere. Once, while serving with the Emperor in Germany, he had got leave of absence to see his wife, who was ill in Spain, and had ridden pell-mell across Europe and back in an incredibly small number of days and nights. Now he rode into merry Alcalá before Maximilian's ship had even been sighted on the east coast. He brought a package of secret instructions for the prince. He brought some bad news too, for the Emperor had sent word that, to avoid offending the taste of his northern subjects, the prince must transform his court into the Burgundian mode. Philip was disgusted. Alba likewise, and all the Castilians. Their etiquette was good enough, they thought, and far better than the more elaborate and pretentious ceremony of the gluttonous Flemings. Hitherto, says Cabrera, lamenting the change, Philip had been served after the custom of his crusading ancestors, simply but elegantly, accompanied here and there or waited upon when he dined by grave lords agreeable and genteel, noble to their fingertips, grandees of Castile. Now he must put up with an interminable mob of upstarts who would get in his way wherever he went and would never leave him a peaceful moment by himself. It took all the following spring to introduce the new customs, to train the numerous servitors, the lords, and Philip himself. It was not until the Feast of the Assumption 1548 that he dined in public at Valladolid, to the disapproval of nearly all his subjects, in the full Burgundian style, with displays of mayordomos, gentlemen of the bucca, mouth, kings of arms, mace-bearers and crossbowmen, cantors, minstrels, trumpeters, kettle-drummers, and the soldiers of his guard distributed through the palace, adds Cabrera with disdain. The most important person in his household henceforth was to be his camarero mayor, or Lord Chamberlain, who could summon all his highness's councillors and held sway over the gentlemen of the household and all the aides and officials thereof. Even nearer, however, to Philip's person was the sommelier de cour, who was always present when his highness arose in the morning to hand him his shirt and other articles of clothing, one by one, as he received them from the grooms of his bedchamber. In fact, this functionary was hardly ever to be got rid of, except in exchange for his understudy, the segundo camarero. He was present at meal-times to hand his highness the napkin. He slept in Philip's room on a low couch, which was brought in at night by the uyuras and taken away in the morning. It was even prescribed that when the gentleman of the bedchamber laid out the sheets on his highness's bed, the sommelier de cour must light the way with a wax candle. For these privileged duties he received more than 600,000 maravedis, besides a pension of some 1,040,000 and other emoluments. His responsibility was great and must have demanded uncommon tact and discretion. He was obliged to follow the king everywhere, even when his majesty entered the apartment of the queen, and must at no time lose sight of him, unless his majesty so commanded, in which case the sommelier retired to the next room and waited. Philip took the greatest care in selecting the officers of his household, according to Cabrera, who adds that the prince's capacity for administration and the cleanness of his life were apparent from the characters and actions of his subordinates. The Duke of Alba served as Philip's mayordomo mayor from then on, and was assisted by Don Pedro de Guzman, Count of Olivares. Don Antonio de Toledo was caballeros mayor. Meanwhile, the ship of Maximilian had at last reached Barcelona, and noble lords sent by Philip and Maria were conducting him to Castilla. On the way, unfortunately, he fell ill of a quartan fever. Philip chafed under the delay. He was under orders from the emperor to see Maximilian married and installed as regent before his departure, yet the sailing season was slipping by, and the autumn tempests would soon be pelting the Mediterranean coasts.